Hey.
Hi.
Hey.
Hi.
This is In at the End.
The podcast.
I'm Alex.
I'm Val, and we don't have anything else besides a podcast, so.
No, this is our whole life.
Yeah.
This is what we do. And this is Sopranos, Season 2, Episode 2, Do Not Resuscitate. We're going to talk about it.
Yep.
As always, we watch the show, and then we come and talk about it.
Yeah, using Alex's music room.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts?
I want to talk about characters.
Okay. Which ones?
Mostly, well, I think for this episode, for me, Livia, Janis, Bobby Baccala.
Great introduction of a new character.
Yeah, I love Bobby.
He's a great character.
And, of course, there's some other characters. We get a little bit of Pussy.
Skip. We have a new character.
We get Skip, yeah. It's funny how that's just one scene in this episode that we get Pussy and Skip.
Is it just one? Is there two? Maybe?
Well, I guess you kind of have Pussy coming out of his surgery.
Yeah.
Or steroid injection.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
It's another very disorienting introduction of something in this show. We have a character who's really looks like another mob character. Kind of like blurring the lines between the enforcement and the mob world. Wearing a tracksuit, having a same kind of build.
We think he's just kind of like an underling at first, right?
Yeah, I mean, all signs and all kind of initial gut reactions to seeing that character would lead us to believing that he's just an unknown member of the mob who we haven't met, especially because we're meeting so many new characters right now in the second season.
Yeah.
But yeah, they really blur the lines with that.
Yeah. Well, and then we have that interaction between him and Pussy, right? Where Pussy's talking about his back surgery. He's like, I don't think my back feels all that much better. Yeah. And then he says, I've got to get in my jacuzzi.
That's very interesting.
So that's interesting in terms of
I gotta get in my jacuzzi.
I gotta get in my jacuzzi.
And also he lies about not seeing Tony. That's another thing.
Yeah.
Skip says, have you seen Tony yet? And he says, like, no, I haven't come back yet. So there's a lot of dishonesty.
But the jacuzzi thing, for those of you who don't remember, goes back to when Polly was trying to get Pussy to go into the baths, have a schwitz. And he said that his doctor said that that's not good for his back, right?
Which was very believable at the time. I mean, that was kind of as much as we could believe. It seemed very truthful, but there is kind of, a statement now that we know that it's not.
Yeah. But that's all we get of them.
Yeah.
We'll get more of Skip.
Yeah, but I mean, that does answer a lingering question. And it's interesting for the show that's so ambiguous at times. They've dealt so much closure at the end of the first season, and now some of those residual questions have already been answered.
I like how they give it to us right up front there.
Yeah.
I really like that.
Well, it just kind of happens.
And they don't make a big deal of it.
No.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it's just kind of like, it is what it is. We get some comments like he's been working with them since 98.
Yeah.
So we don't know if that's like pre-first season or during first season. Or
it came out in 99, and it was filmed in 1998. But I don't think that kind of timeline is specifically referenced in the show. We know it's very much around there, but again, that's an ambiguity.
Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, though, this show has now made a pattern of revealing these important plot developments in seemingly unimportant ways. So we have major points of the story developing through people's subconscious, or kind of just being thrown at us, or major events just happening in the blink of an eye, like Vin Makazian jumping off of the bridge. And that's a really interesting way to kind of break the TV trope, I think, too, that this show does. It's very unpredictable in terms of how it develops the actual story.
Yeah, I just love that this thing with Pussy happens at just the very beginning of the episode. Usually in normal TV that would be like an end of episode cliffhanger, it would be this thing,
or end of season.
Totally.
Yeah.
Whereas this is just like,
just
we're like, what's even going, we didn't know he was going in for this surgery at all. We're just like, what happened to Pussy?
Well, and interestingly, too, this is almost the beginning of Pussy actually getting a lot of screen time. This is actually almost the introduction of his character. I mean,
we really don't know him before this.
He was around, and he was introduced especially near the end of season 1, but he's completely a lesser character, and then he actually disappears.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, actually, like his arc actually rather early, he has to grapple with, and we have to grapple with him being an informant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think like it is like we are getting to know him. Like this is a big part of who he is as a character. It's a big part of his arc.
Definitely.
So, you know, we really didn't know Pussy before.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk, maybe I should just jump right into it, but I wanted to talk about Livia because there were some really interesting things for her in this episode. So we have her, she's still in the hospital post this, you know, like whatever they're calling this non-stroke that she had and this face-saving therapy so that she can feel like she's receiving therapy. But she changes her tune on a couple of things this episode, which I thought was really interesting.
Yes.
So the first one that we see is that she's talking to Janis, and we used to see her always, whenever Johnny Soprano would come up, she would be saying, like, he was a saint. He was right? He was a saint. And then in this episode, she actually is saying to Janis, like, you didn't know what kind of man your father was. Like, you didn't know what it was like to live with him, right? So we see this very opposite thing. The other thing we see her say, and I thought this was really funny, and it's very Livia in a lot of ways, too, maybe funnier than the thing about Johnny Soprano, but she talks about, she's like, Janis says, do you want to go back to your house? And she says, oh no, I want to go back to that other place. And Janis says, Green Grove. And she says, I thought you didn't like it there or whatever. And she says, it's not so bad. You get fresh towels every day. Which was really great. I mean, we always assumed that, you know, Johnny Soprano was not the best guy to live with and that there were issues there, but we never heard her say it.
No.
Likewise, we kind of saw that in some ways she did enjoy her time at Green Grove, but she never would have said that before. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Totally. No, I think that in this episode, actually, there was a lot of people changing their tunes in a way that fit them in the moment to manipulate the people around them. I found that was happening a lot, and maybe it does stem from Livia because with the introduction of Janis, we have one of the most sociopathic characters the show ever develops.
Yeah.
But we have kind of a new level of manipulations, and I felt like everybody was constantly changing their tunes. In fact, it was interesting, the one that you brought up, right before that, I liked just like a completely tiny thing. But in the beginning, she's complaining about her tapioca and how she wants the ice cream. And then when Janis comes, she's like, oh, would you like some of my tapioca, after trying to replace it? Like, she's like trying to give it to her as this like friendly, good-hearted thing. But we know that she hated it and was just complaining about it. But it also plays into this show, people using food amongst other things to manipulate people. And something that led into really interestingly for me was people using music to manipulate people.
Right.
And that plays into Janis with Meadow, who all of a sudden is kind of a different character when she's associating with Meadow. And she's also
like
a different...
the fun aunt.
The fun aunt, right. And she says, how about Grandma in that rehab center? She can kind of prey off of Meadow's concern for her grandmother that she feels. And she asks her, you know, what does she like? What's she interested in? She gets the information about the De Castro sisters, saying, you know, like, oh, that makes sense. It was too easy to be something more obvious than that. And Mario Lasagna, which is obviously not his real name.
That's a good name, though.
Yeah, but it's a good name. It's a good name for a singer. But it's interesting how then she goes and she talks about, I never forgot how much you love a good tenor. And she did forget. Yeah. She did not remember that. She got that information from Meadow, and she made a calculation that by bringing up that information, it was something that she could use against her to get into the house. So we can see her maneuvering, and we can see the steps of it. And so she manipulates Meadow in a way to get information, privileged information, and then she brings it, and then she kind of changes face too, saying, you know, there's like soft light on her from the window, and she's kind of smiling. I never forgot how much you love a good tenor. Well, she did. She did not remember what actually was something that her mom cared about.
Yeah. I also thought that on first listen that she says, I never forgot how you like a big tenor. And I thought it was another fat reference
well, there's a lot
in
of fat
this
references
episode.
in this episode.
Maybe we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. But so totally.
A Pavarotti joke.
Joke. A good Pavarotti joke.
Yeah.
It's interesting, too, how there's that focus on music, and then it cuts to Janis driving in her car, now smoking pot, listening to Paul Simon.
Yeah.
Two things that Livia clearly would not approve of.
Right.
So, yeah, she's kind of a different person and has different tastes and is actually quite far from what Livia is looking for.
Yeah. The other thing, and I guess like maybe we can kind of branch into Janis a little bit, but we also see like these kind of, not so much like using, like manipulating people in such a way, but we see a couple times in this episode like things that are like very reflected of each other, right? Like it's these like lines are used in the same way. And the one I was going to point out before when I was talking about the kind of flip on Johnny Soprano and actually saying like he was a terrible guy to live with. Mm-hmm. It was interesting when they're sitting at the dinner table with Janis and the rest of the Soprano family, and they're talking about, and Janis is kind of like complaining about Livia at this point. Mm-hmm. She says she's a complete narcissist. She's always like me, right? We see Tony then talking about like, oh, like young guys, they're no good these days or whatever. They're all me, right? So we see him reflect that. But anyways, so now I'm talking in circles. But when they're at the dinner table and Janis says she's a narcissist, me, she says to Tony, kudos, you're a saint. Yeah. And she calls him a saint for like putting up with Livia or whatever. And so it is funny how these people who have to put up with Livia, which, you know, Johnny would have had to as well, even though he was probably a piece of shit also. That
he was definitely a piece of shit.
Yeah, I mean they're all pieces of shit, really, like truly.
It's a spectrum of shittiness.
But I thought that was interesting, that like reflection of the me. We also have a couple times that World War II and World War II vets are mentioned, right? So we have in the lawyer's office Junior being referred to as a World War II vet. He says that an ankle tracker sounds like Nazi Germany, which was pretty astute of him. But then we also have Reverend James Sr., who, like, we see pictures of him when he was in the war. Tony thinks he might like the History Channel. And then we have the final kind of discussion between Reverend James Jr. and Tony in the end after the father has died. Talking about kind of like the greatest generation and stuff like that. And then my last one is just as a reflection from last week. I wrote down, I didn't talk about it in last episode, but in both last episode and this episode, we have Tony say in each episode 2 times, she's dead to me. And then Livia say 1 time, let me die. In both episodes. So they're clearly like, again, with this DNR kind of talk, right? They were establishing that last episode. And then I guess we also have like we have a lot of scenes between Janis and Livia, which I really love, and maybe we want to break them down a little bit more. But we also have Livia kind of, I don't know, for the first time, maybe like almost calling people out for what they are also, right? So she says to Janis, you're here because you want to take my house, which is totally true, right?
How astute, yeah.
And she really got that.
And she warns Carmela when she calls the house at the end.
And she warns Carmela that Janis is a snake in the grass. Yeah. I just found that really interesting that she like would come right out and say that. And then we have her manipulating Janis later when she's doing her session with the nurse, and she's like, oh, I'll give you all my money. Right. And then she's like, didn't I tell you where I hid my money? Right? Like, I thought that scene was really well done. Again, it's one of these scenes where as a viewer, you're left like, is she senile or is she doing this on purpose? Because she plays it so well.
She's kind of a master. Yeah.
She's a total master of doing that.
Well, and the fact too that you see the stairs in the background, Janis seeing Livia actually falling down the stairs. That's a weird soprano scene. It's weird, but actually that becomes such a potent symbol in this show, stairs. Yeah. And I don't think that's something that we've talked about that much. So for me, that was almost like the introduction of that symbol into the language that they're building.
I get that. I mean, I didn't think they needed to like put Livia's face onto like a falling character. Like I kind of got it. Right. Just because they were like flashing back and forth, and then they like put her face onto it. That was a little much for me.
It was a little stronger than they normally go.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to think of that scene in particular as heavy-handed as it was, because as this season and subsequent seasons go on, we're going to see a lot of cruel moments happening on stairs to a lot of different characters.
Totally.
And so I recommend for viewers to pay attention to stairs when they show up in the frame and when events happen around stairs, because I think that really does become a symbol that we'll be talking about in episodes to come.
And well, we know the story. We already had like one mention of stairs, right? About like Livia laughing while Johnny Boy Soprano fell down the stairs or something, right?
That's right. We did talk about it in that episode.
Yeah.
So already it's kind of referencing itself.
Yeah. The other thing in terms of Livia, and there's kind of like, there's two mentions kind of Janis leaving and coming back and things like that. But Livia says to her, "You could never stand it here. You could never stand yourself." Mm-hmm. And I think that was like a great line in terms of Janis, because we really do see that she plays this character. And I think like people who play a character, like they don't like who they really are, right? So they're trying to put on this other facade, but you can see right through it, right?
Yeah.
Like that scene that you mentioned where we see Janis like standing in the window, kind of like looking angelic. Mm-hmm. But then we have a scene right after where we kind of like, we see her without that light on her, and she has this like ugly face going on, you know? So it's hard.
She's all over the place. Almost with every character, she's acting in a different way.
Yeah, totally.
She's constantly manipulating. One that we didn't talk about too is actually when she's talking to Livia about going back to the nursing home, and Livia says, you know, it's not so bad there. And then Janis actually starts to say, it's dangerous there. You know, and that guy, they suspect foul play. Maybe he's gone like, now it's just getting kind of preposterous that she would be arguing that she shouldn't be returning because of the danger, especially because their family's the one that's responsible for anything happening to him. If there's danger coming from anywhere, it's from within their own family.
Totally.
They've actually brought danger to Green Grove.
Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's also clearly an attempt to manipulate, because Livia returning to Green Grove isn't in the interest of Janis.
Yeah.
So that introduced something interesting for me, which is that I think there's a lot of examples in this episode of different characters who change the tune of what they're saying and purposefully misreport facts or stories in order to serve their own purpose. And I thought that there was a fair amount of examples. So, I mean, there was that one I was just saying. There's
there's Reverend James
of
Jr.,
course.
right? Like, we don't know until the very end of that episode that he and Tony were involved in this whole, like, like setting up this whole protest / riot thing going on, right? Mm-hmm. We only see Tony interacting with the senior Reverend James.
Well, and indirectly with the foreman.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. But we don't know that they were both in on it until very late in the episode. Yeah. And Tony didn't even let anyone else know about that. He didn't let the foreman know, or the guys who he had going in to beat them up, right? Like,
yeah, it's interesting. He's really playing all sides against each other, which is exactly what Skip says to Pussy in the car. Play them against the middle, right?
Yeah.
So, I feel like that's what all characters are doing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's such a taboo against ratting, you know, or going against the family, and yet all these characters are abusing trust and manipulating and telling stories all the time. We have AJ bringing up the DNR to Livia's again. He's just ruining
everything all the time.
That's basically the only purpose of AJ as a character right now, is to ruin things that people aren't supposed to know.
Yeah, although it's funny, just before you go on, just in terms of AJ, we get two great lines during that short time he spends with Livia. The first thing that she says is, "I thought you were Janis," which, again, we get these kind of indicators about like who David Chase sees AJ as, and like who AJ might become. It's never good. There's never like good indicators for AJ. But yeah, I thought you were Janis.
There's a great scene actually when Janis and Tony are talking about the DNR, and actually Janis brought it up to Tony with the intention of manipulating, I believe. And then she actually gets Tony, after multiple confrontations, to agree about them living in the house, because he says that it would be worth it to see them together. But one thing that we see in the background is AJ actually eating ice cream.
Right.
Which is like, again, we've seen that he was eating ice cream at the end of Down Neck with his dad after Tony was exercising.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of talk of salads in this episode, and actually like a cut to salads.
Yeah.
Right after that was brought up.
Yeah.
Amongst also like the classic like meat imagery that we're seeing. But AJ's just kind of in the background, like eating something unhealthy that they've already kind of established as a symbol. And it's interesting how Janis is using, I mean, it's pretty morbid, using a Do Not Resuscitate about, essentially letting their mother die to manipulate getting into the house. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like the level of sociopathy in this episode in particular really reaches a new level. The introduction of Janis, and now that she's been fleshed out as a character, really means that watching this show, there's like a new level of just kind of constant Machiavellian maneuvering. Mm-hmm. The other one that's really interesting is Meadow says, there's no trust in this family. Check the mileage if you want to, when she says that she's driving AJ. Again, acting angelic.
But where does she go?
We don't really know.
She says
She's something about Hunter.
Oh, yeah.
Scangarello.
Or maybe she's like volunteering there or something.
Yeah, I think they were gonna. She wasn't going there to hang out with Livia.
Okay.
That's what we know.
Yeah.
But again, that's interesting because they're playing this kind of like angelic character going to visit their grandmother. Meadow's not even doing that. Turns it against them, which is something that we've seen Tony do, even against Meadow, like in college.
Yeah.
Check the mileage if you want to, and then that's a lie.
I also like when Janis asks her, like, you know Grandma well, like, what's she into? And she says, I don't know, negativity. I thought that was a good line. Yeah.
There was another one of manipulation that I thought was really interesting and used some symbols. The first time Janis confronts Tony and they're out by the pool, which first of all is just like a kind of like a fascinating image. Tony's out there with his feet in the
There's like a
in the
glow
water
of the pool.
There's a glow. Yeah. He's smoking a cigar, which is typically like a scene of him kind of being in control, which I'll reference in a second. But he actually says, that's why I moved out here, a little bit of nature. And we've talked a lot about that house being surrounded by nature.
She's talking about missing the fireflies.
Yeah. So, and with his feet in the water, there's a lot of the imagery of the kind of like eternal that Tony's surrounded by in that moment. But
we see a similar glowing light on Livia after she calls Carmela.
Yes.
Later on in the episode, like almost the same color as the glowing pool in the hospital.
Yeah. But that was an interesting interaction between the two of them where they're going back and forth on what they can do. And Tony says, well, take her back to Greengrove. And then Janis says, I don't have that kind of money. And then Tony kind of smirks, smokes a cigar. Janis takes out a cigarette. Again, like a very clear usage of cigarette as lack of control, cigar as control, which we've seen a few times now as well. So I thought that, that was really interesting. But again, Janis is coming out there, she says, I know it's not your favorite subject. I don't want to harp on it. But like, she has a mission.
Agenda, yeah.
She has an agenda. And, she's out to serve herself. And she is now maneuvering as much as she can to get those things to happen.
Yeah. The other character, like we have the other manipulation going on is like now we have Junior's back out into the world, right? Yeah. So like he's clearly like made some maneuvers and manipulated to get there. But the one thing that we go back to is kind of his inability, I think his real inability to accept that it was Livia who manipulated him into the hit on Tony. And I believe him. I believe him when he says to Tony, like, she didn't manipulate me. Like, he can't see it that way.
Right.
Like, whether it's like, that he really truly believes that, or it's like he doesn't want to lose face.
Well, it's like the same thing as in the last episode, where when they're asking him to flip, and they say, if you testify that Tony is the boss, and he says, that Strunes, like, there's there's no way my nephew could handle it.
Yeah.
So yeah, like he's actually unable to process and deal with maybe some of the realities of what's going on around him.
Yeah. I think it was interesting too in terms of like what they called for Livia, like this like face saving therapy, right? Like Junior's trying to save face. And so, like that's, I don't know, that just made me think of that for some reason. Like how do people protect their own image? Right. Yeah.
Totally. The next bigger thing that I wanted to talk about was this focus on the greatest generation, the story of World War II, and then the focus too on the Reverend Senior, James Senior, and also Junior and Livia. I feel like this episode kind of starts to zero in on those characters of that older generation, that golden generation, but really starting to examining them as a generation that is on the verge of dying.
Right.
And passing
like
the
going
torch.
Extinct. Yeah.
Yeah. And that conversation between Tony and Reverend James Sr., when the last one dies, it signals the beginning of the last stretch for us. No, that Senior. Junior. Yes, Junior. You're correct.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Tony and Reverend James Jr. at the very end of the episode, James Jr. says when the last one dies, it signals the beginning of the last stretch for us.
Right.
You know, Tony's referring to himself as a kid, and there's something delusional about that as well.
Yeah.
And as that greatest generation is moving on, there's something that's happening here where all those values that Tony and the Momsters hold to be so dear, and they talk about, you know, especially like in that the cold open in the second episode, where they really establish like those things that they hold true. And they're talking about like the values of the mob and how things are going to shit. Well,
and the line in this episode where he says, like, I forget exactly how he prefaces it, but like the young guys, they're all drug addicts.
Yeah.
Whatever, right?
Yeah.
They're all me. And he's really like, it seems like he's really referring to, like, we've talked before about like Christopher, how he stands out as different. Like they always like, he doesn't have the same commitment to the values.
Yeah.
And stuff like that the older generation did, right?
Yeah.
Like he is a different generation.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to think about that like passage.
Well,
of
and
time.
we see that too. I mean, for example, even Reverend James Jr. compared to Senior was hiding this from his dad. And Tony says, you know, I can see that he would have been disapproving of this. And I think it's fascinating. Even also that last song, Goodnight, My Love, that they're playing, the Benny Goodman recording. There's something about James Sr. dying, Junior falling, and having this kind of like weakening moment
old
where
moment.
he relies on Tony to kind of carry him, and that old song coming from the 1930s as he leaves, like "Good Night, My Love." There's something about that generation kind of leaving for me. It's like a farewell or something to those values, because it continues to be watered down.
Yeah.
And I think we start to see a lot of the mistakes that the parents made of the great generation, and the next generation reflects on and realizes they're making the same mistakes, and we see the next generation falling into some of the same traps.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's just kind of like this development of mistakes that leads from one generation to the next.
Well, it's just different. Like we even see it with like Junior's house and Livia's house, for example, and there was a reference to that in this episode. Like I think it's Janis that said like Daddy bought that house, right?
Yeah.
She said that to Tony. And their houses are quite average houses, and then of course we see a shot of Tony's home, which is this like, you know, Mondo mansion.
Yeah.
Like just kind of the values of the 1950s, I guess. I don't know, like the kind of that golden generation, that they lived a little bit more humbly, I guess. And kind of this whole, like the whole thing with Livia's trying to return to her house and Janis really wanting this house. It's not that great of a house, right? And we know from last episode that it's been like ransacked by teens, you know, by teens, right? So we see that too, right? Like this thing that was so important to them, and Janis did say like Daddy bought that house, and that would have been, you know, in the whatever, in that generation, like a really big deal to buy a house, right? So I don't know. Just made me think of the differences between like how we see the older generation, and then we see Tony's generation, and then we see like Christopher's generation.
Yeah, totally. And AJ and Meadow. You know, there was a few things with them actually. One, AJ's kind of hilarious fascination with DNA in this episode.
Funny,
Basically, every scene he has, he's somehow bringing up DNA, which is interesting because that's a particularly positive focus for him compared to what we've seen previously.
Yeah, he's like doing a school project,
Yeah, and he's really into it. Now, what's interesting about that is there's like a scene where there's that cut to salad, actually, that I was talking about.
Yeah.
And they're going to sit down. AJ's talking about DNA. Carm's not really listening to him at all. And he's kind of bringing up these things and like looking for a reaction. And she just kind of like glosses over it, which is interesting. I thought that like
she's not really listening to him.
He's not really getting engaged by anybody on DNA. I mean, even when he goes to Livia and he's like, I know what DNA is, but what is DNR? Yeah. But he actually doesn't get anything from her either in terms of engaging him on something that's positive and of interest to him at the time, or anybody. And the big one, and this is another, what I feel is an introduction of kind of like a symbol or just like a metaphor in this show, is Meadow as a driver. So she talks about passing her test and that she had to parallel park, but it was, difficult. She didn't think she was going to do it, but they passed her anyway, which is interesting because that's a direct link to the last episode where Meadow's parallel parking. I spoiled it. Meadow parks a car. Sorry, everybody. I still recommend that you watch the show. It's totally worth it.
There's some other things that happen.
There's a few other things that happen. That's the big one.
Yeah.
But that's, that's what happens at the end of the whole show is Meadow parks a car.
Yeah. Amazing. But it's kind of these, like, for Meadow, it's an interesting one. And we see this with other characters, too. It kind of shows you, like the impact of taking a shortcut on things too, or something like.
Yes. That's kind of what I was.
Even with AJ, like he's looking for other people to kind of do this project for him in some ways. Like he's like, I need to do this project.
Yeah.
Do you know how many, whatever they say, like in a DNA chain, how many whatever there are. Right. I don't really know that much about DNA either, but and then Meadow, like passing her test, maybe because she's a soprano. I don't know, right? Like we don't know
that, but we do know that she's driving with Janis, who's trying to manipulate her to get information. She says, "Did you just go through a stop sign?" Yeah. So she's clearly being a horrible driver.
She's terrible.
She's not good at this, but she's still getting a pass to go and do it in the world. She references I think it's Tony who says like, oh, well, you had the best teacher. Well, clearly she didn't. But there is a theme in this show of people taking shortcuts, people not putting in the work, and people kind of engaging in behavior that ends up being damaging to others because they're not really fully qualified or ready for it. And I think that Meadow as a driver is interesting because her parents haven't really taken the time to train her, teach her the right way. And there's maybe, there's something dangerous about that.
Totally. Yeah.
But that's interesting because that's the first time that we start to see that, Meadow driving.
Well, we see her a little bit in the montage in the season 2 opener.
That's right.
She's running over some pylons.
Well, she really sucks at driving.
She sucks.
Okay. What else do you have? I have a few things.
I want to talk about Bobby Baccala.
That's what I want to talk about. Let's talk about Bobby Baccala.
Let's talk about that fat fuck. There are so many references to people being fat.
There's a lot in this episode.
My favorite one is calzone with legs.
Calzone with legs. It's a great name.
Yeah.
Well, what I thought was interesting is the first scene where Bobby walks in, where we're introduced to Bobby Baccala. He kind of walks through the plastic drape sort of thing.
He has this suckling pig poster behind him.
Yeah, and it says any size suckling pig, I think. Yes, any size suckling pig. Oh, well, in my notes it said any size suckling pig size, but I'm thinking that that's probably not.
Probably not.
Any size suckling pig. But what was interesting is in the background of that scene where he first walks in, there's literally hanging animals and pictures of steak.
Yeah.
It's just meats everywhere. Yeah. They're just in a room surrounded by meats. Which also reminds me to the pilot when Christopher shoots Emil and he's kind of surrounded by the meats and they reference the sausages and stuff. There's something kind of like meaty for me that relates those scenes of like excessive raw meats with death and the mob. With that kind of scene happening in the back, it's really kind of overkill how much meat is there. Like, it would have been enough to be surrounded by hanging pigs and hanging animals, but the fact that there's literally like pictures of steaks, red steaks, and everywhere, taking up pretty much every inch of wall space. Yeah. It at least gives a mood to his first scene. Yeah. There's something, Well, it's definitely associating food at a minimum. Yeah.
Totally. I don't know. Like, I really like Bobby. He's a character I really like. And I kind of forgot how we got there, right? Like, he says, like, I inherited Junior, right? Because basically Tony and the other guys are accusing him of being a gossip, like the guy who was killed.
Parisi.
Like Philly Parisi. Yeah. Who we'll see Patsy coming up pretty soon, the same actor. But so they're basically like they were trying to get rid of Junior's crew, basically, right? Yeah. They killed Mikey, they killed Philly, and these people who were being a gossip. So the thing we know about Bobby is that he's he's not a gossip, right? Like, he's actually a pretty upstanding guy.
Yeah.
Because he gives a little bit of, back talk to them and stuff like that, but he communicates their message to Junior, like he's doing what he's asked of, what's asked of him, and he's just treated like shit. Yeah. And and maybe he is kind of like one of the more upstanding characters, and they treat him like he's trash. Yeah.
Well, he also looks after Junior.
Yeah.
Like, in a very kind of caring way.
Well, that's, I think, his new role. Like, that wasn't his role before. Right. But now we see him in this role.
Yeah. He also really doesn't get jokes.
I know.
Junior has a joke. Well, it's not a great joke. It's a racist joke.
Yeah. I mean, maybe he just doesn't like racism.
Maybe. But anyway, all signs are pointing to him not really fitting into the kind of, like, boys club of the mob.
Yeah. I love him.
There's so many comments, though. There's so many things talking about just, like, fatness and foods in this episode. There was also that story, the war story,
about the
Junior
guy,
saying he even took a fat guy who was in his 30s.
No,
who was a cook.
No, that was that was Reverend James Sr.
That's right.
I know you're confused about Junior, Reverend James Jr.
This is my
and
downfall.
Reverend James Sr. I know, but the person who told that story was Reverend James Sr.
Oh, the prefixes? Is that what those are? Junior, senior?
Suffixes.
Suffixes. See? I can't do it. It's confusing. I don't get it.
Except for Junior.
Junior's a prefix.
Well, I think that's just his name.
Wow. This is a lot for me.
I know. It's a lot. But, yeah, so he tells the story about his time in the war because he was 28, Reverend James Sr. Yeah. He was 28 when he went to the war. He says in 43 they were taking anyone. They took even this fat guy that I knew who was already 34.
Yeah. You don't want to be a fat guy.
Well, they are fat. All of them are pretty fat.
There is that, like, aspect of, like, not realizing.
Yeah.
And that's what Bobby says.
After Tony drives away. I love how he doesn't say anything to Tony's face, but he was like, look in a mirror. Good insult.
Yeah, good one, Bobby.
Good, yeah.
Great joke.
Yeah.
Few small things. Do you have some other things?
No.
Okay. Well, very few. I thought it was interesting that the episode started with a focus on Tony's watch as he goes to meet with Junior. If anything, just to connect the last episode with this, like, intense focus on the passing of time, ending off with the song about time, and then starting this episode, like, with the focus on the watch. We were kind of following the clocks and watches, kind of, like, tracking the passage of time in the last episode moving forward. Well, there's something that kind of, like, connects those pieces, which is interesting in this show, which is kind of like this, like, collection almost of short stories. But it is all pieced together and organized in this larger form. Yeah. Just kind of see something that kind of references itself.
Yeah, well, we also have these kind of, like, I don't know, with, like, grounding moments, I guess is the best way I can come up with. Like, we actually have, like, 2 dinners in this episode, right? Like, we have one dinner where they're talking about, like, Janis is like, I know it's not your favorite topic, but, like, stuff about the mom. And then the next dinner that she arrives late to and is, like, making excuses for herself, that's when she's like, oh, she's a narcissist, it's always me, right? So we kind of have this, like, sense of time passing because we have these, like, 2 dinners in a row, right? It gives a sense like it's at least a day later.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, using food and family time to kind of establish time.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah.
I thought that it was interesting that Tony is specifically targeting this kind of African American cause and this African American employment issue and kind of manipulating it from both sides given his relationship with that community. Yeah. And even also just also manipulating in Junior scene where they're manipulating the judge based on his service in the war.
Right.
And there's something kind of like a duality in terms of like manipulating causes and issues and oppression of people to kind of get these bad actors off the hook.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was trying to figure out how that conflict, like, between the construction company and the African American workers, like, how that kind of was reflected in other parts of the episode. But I think that's really it. Or at least it's something about it.
Yeah.
But it is. It's like, you know, using these causes that speak to people and that are true, like, you know, truly worthy of concern, and then using that to your own advantage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, it was a great episode. Big surprise.
It was.
Give it an A, just like all the others.
Do they sign a DNR for Livia ever?
Oh, good question. Well, let's see.
Let's see. Cool.
So, thanks for listening.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time. We might have a new character coming up. Some more new characters. Rather big one.
Oh, I think so.
So, keep watching. Keep listening. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.